Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The Delectable Negro by Vincent Woodward. Tonight, we're on chapter 5, and this is part 6 of the series, Eating Nat Turner. Most people do not readily associate Nat Turner, the heroic figure and slave insurrectionist, with the themes of auto-cannibalism, which is self-consumption, white male consumptive desires, or homoeroticism. These themes, however, strongly informed how Southampton, Virginia whites punished Turner and treated his corpse after his public lynching. In the 19th century, the white press throughout the country reported that Turner had sold his body for dissection and spent the money on ginger cakes. Many papers reported that Turner feasted on these sweet ginger cakes before his own execution. This was an erroneous assertion, as slaves did not own themselves and therefore had no agency to barter and trade in their own flesh. More than anything, this ginger cakes story reflected the psychology of whites who needed to convince themselves that Black men, such as Turner, somehow consented to and were complicit in their own social consumption. This linking of consent to Black self-consumption was a common idea that found its way into lynching ritual practices in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1934, whites made Claude Neal, whom they lynched in Jackson County, Florida, eat his cut-off penis and testicles. James McGovern relates the details of the Neal lynching in Anatomy of a Lynching, when he says, after taking the nigger to the woods about 4 miles from Greenwood, they cut off his penis. He was made to eat it. Then they cut off his testicles and made him eat them and say he liked it. Making Neal eat his own sexual organs, as grotesque as this was only a byproduct of an even more disturbing reality of white hunger and power. The cutting off and forced eating of the penis was a reflection of white male oral fixations upon Black male virility and Black men as a sexual threat. In a different erotic scenario, the white men might have taken the Black penis into their own mouths or anuses, but it was the absence of such imaginative privacy. They used the Black male body as a type of puppet through which they grope, grapple, and ultimately subdue their hungers for Black male flesh and sex. On the level of ritual, it is not enough to simply desire and want to consume Neal. The ritual is not complete until he eats the evidence of white desire, swallowing his debasement and degradation, along with the white hunger and erotic fascination. So as you can see, white people have this sick fixation with Black people and with our genitalia. Remember what they did to Sarah Bartman? They put her genitals in a glass jar under display for centuries. Many whites feared that Turner would literally rise from the grave and rebone himself. This is how some have explained the gruesome cannibalization of Turner after his death. William Sidney Drury, a member of the Southampton community, documented the Southampton insurrection in 1900, the exact methods of punishment and post-mortem abuse of Turner's body. According to Drury, after Turner was executed, his body was delivered to doctors who skinned it and made grease of the flesh. Mr. R.S. Barham's father owned a money purse made of his hide. This desire to literally possess Turner's flesh and make use of his body calls to mind the homoerotics of the Neil scenario, with Turner's flesh serving as fetish and symbol of corporeal possession. The money purse, made out of Turner's skin, and the grease made from his boiled down flesh convey the limitless consumptive uses of the slave and the myriad of ways in which the ruling class could satiate unspoken desires and tastes for Negro flesh. Blacks of Southampton community further complicated this erotics of taste through accusations that white ingested Turner's boiled down flesh as a medicinal substance, as I discussed earlier. William Styron brought all of this suppressed homoerotic and consumptive history to the fore with the publication of The Confessions of Nat Turner, written in 1968. In Styron's The Confessions and the debate that surrounded it clarified, like no moment had before, why Black people have maintained a tight-lipped silence on the subject of homoeroticism under slavery. Homoeroticism, especially in the context of Turner's legacy, brought up for Black people in the 1960s unspeakable issues of white consumption of Blacks, sexual objectification, bestial treatment under a white regime, and the inconceivable topic of auto-cannibalism, which is where Blacks were made to eat one another and themselves during slavery. In the 1960s, this was a moment when the legacy of Black consumption under slavery culminated around activist platforms and ideologies of the civil rights and Black power movements. The subjects of slavery, homosexuality, and cannibalism took front-page prominence in newspapers and journals, editorials, speak-outs, and mediated conversations between Blacks and whites. In this chapter, I used the Black radical 1960s to further illuminate the myriad of social, spiritual, political, and moral implications of white hunger for and consumption of the Black male during slavery. Issues of memory and temporality figure prominently in this chapter and drive my desire to understand the emotional and psychic forces that accrued around Turner's person, lending his life a mythic and trans-historical significance in the 1960s. Some of the Black men who responded collectively to Styron's novel in the widely read William Styron's Nat Turner, 10 Black Writers Respond, accused Styron of institutionalized cannibalism, of attempting to eat Nat Turner. These Black men referred to the legacy of white cannibalism that I discussed in earlier chapters. In this mid-20th century movement, characterized by political activism, Black self-determination, and anti-apartheid efforts at home and abroad, Black people powerfully linked individual and institutional consumption of the Negro to a negative understanding of homosexuality and effeminacy. The implicit homoerotics of flesh tasting and the particulars of white culinary appetite for Black flesh congealed in this moment. One thing that was clarified through this union and in the context of national debate was why. Why during and beyond slavery it has been so difficult for Black people to talk openly about homoeroticism, and furthermore, to talk in complex ways about the linkages among Black male gender formation, intimacy patterns originating in slavery, same-sex desire, and racial uplift. Why is it so difficult for us to talk about these things? In this chapter and through Turner's legacy, I broached the issue of why so little evidence and analysis of homoeroticism during slavery has survived. By referencing the antebellum cannibalism debate, discussions of resistance and revolt during slavery, and the charged pivotal 1960s, I ground this idea of homoerotic survival in the political and social context. Because what this 1960s movement reveals, among many startling revelations, is how homoeroticism, in the context of the Black experience, has always been embedded in issues of Black nation formation, liberation politics, and the legacy of literal and metaphoric Black consumption. In the second portion of this chapter, James Baldwin emerges as an important mediating figure and filter from my discussion on homoeroticism and Black culture formation in the 1960s. As a friend of Styron and nationally acknowledged Black activist and artist, Baldwin found himself in the uncomfortable position of speaking as a Black and homosexual person who understood the import of Blacks and whites breaking their historical silence concerning the homoerotic legacies of slavery. Rather than disavowing Styron's use of Turner's memory, Baldwin felt it necessary that white artists such as Styron be allowed to work through their fears of and fixations about the Black revolutionary. Baldwin saw Styron confronting Black people with the disturbing but necessary vision of a shared racial history and feared that Black people would, out of their terror at the past and mistrust of white people, miss out on this historic opportunity to dialogue and confront the past. At base, Baldwin advocated for a model of Black homoeroticism that incorporated and transferred the trauma of the past. I resuscitate Baldwin's model and correlate it with the visions and racial uplift politics of the same Black male race leaders who denied and denigrated his person and vision. Wow. Greetings, Sister Raw and the elders listening with you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have highlighted how Nat Turner was consumed and white writers, specifically Styron writing in the 60s, was making an attempt at dissecting cannibalism, Black politics, and homoerotic desires of white people. And James Baldwin, who was Styron's friend as an artist and a homosexual person that was Black, was defending him and saying that white people should be allowed to work out these fears publicly. So this is going to be interesting. The Negro homosexual problem. W.E.B. Du Bois's powerful framing of the Negro problem has gone down in history as one of the most formative premises of the beginning of the 20th century. This question literally haunted the lives and social strivings of Black people in the 19th and 20th centuries. For it was emancipation, the acquisition of the vote, and the desire to own property and contribute as a full member of society that made the Negro problematic. This was not a static problem. Rather, it was the outgrowth of cataclysmic, dynamic social change. The Negro problem and the Negro's emergence into full protected citizen status, which we still don't have today, were two sides of the same coin. Acknowledging the 20th century importance of this problem, I would like to propose a slight amendment to its scope. In the 1960s, a newer, more complicated version of this problematic emerged into the national scene, and that was the problem of homosexuality within the Black experience. From the antebellum period on, this problem had percolated and boiled beneath Black family structures, racial liberation and uplift, and icons of male heroism and valiance. In 1967, this bedrock gave way to the lava underneath, and that had long remained unspoken in the mainstream took on frightening voice and form. The occasion for this eruption was the publication of Styron's The Confessions. Styron described the novel in the author's note as a mediation on history. Styron took the title of the text directly from Thomas R. Gray's interview with Turner, The Confessions of Nat Turner, written in 1831, which Gray published after Turner was executed. The novel explores the specifics of Turner's upbringing and his relationship with his kinsmen. Special attention is given to the topics of his parental lineage, his life on the plantation as a house slave, his early interactions with and feelings toward his enslaved kinsmen, his acquisition of literacy, and his lifelong mission of enlightening his fellow men. It culminates, of course, with the Southampton insurrection. In keeping with the confessional format of the original confessions in the novel, Turner tells his story to a fictional Gray, a court-appointed attorney who visits him while he awaits execution and records all the minutiae of his life. Widely reviewed and well received, Styron's novel received the Pulitzer Prize in 1968 and was translated into at least 5 different languages, including Spanish, German, and Italian. Even before its publication, the New American Library paid $100,000 for the paperback rights. The Book of the Month Club set a personal record by offering $150,000 for the novel. Styron could not have known his novel would become a lightning rod for racial controversy. He was not the first, nor would he be the last, to revisit the memory of Turner in order to make sense of his life for a present generation. The publication of Styron's novel collided with a number of other historical forces to produce an explosive effect. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st, 1965. On March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. 4 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And approximately a month and a half later, Styron received the Pulitzer Prize for a novel that, in the minds of many, denigrated the memory of King and other Black freedom fighters and revolutionaries. Of all these historical occurrences, set the stage for the Black Power era and marked a time of increased Black militancy which Turner's revolutionary legacy embodied. Unlike those who struggled during the 40s or 50s, Blacks at this moment in history grew more vocal about the connection between their radical efforts and historical recovery efforts, and were therefore not willing to allow Styron or any other white person to continue to appropriate and determine the meaning of their radical heroes from the past. Greetings, Redo 9002. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. In an essay of the novel, Oliver Killens felt moved to correlate King's death with that of other valiant freedom fighter Nat Turner. Concerning Styron's depiction of Turner, he notes, it reveals more about the psyche of the Southern liberal Styron, direct descendant of old Massa, than it even begins to reveal about the heart and soul and mind of Black revolutionary Nat Turner. He goes on to correlate the popular reception of Styron's novel with the death of King. Black brothers and sisters, be not deceived by the obscene weeping and gnashing of teeth by white America over the assassination of our great Black brother and Messiah, Martin Luther King. They loved him not, or he would still be among us. They understood him not. Our Martin was a revolutionary, and they did not dig him. Therefore, they destroyed him. Black people felt themselves assailed from all sides in the present moment by white racist institutions and ideologies. And in their memories of the past, they felt the whites, like Styron, had stripped from them and distorted. Blacks felt that Styron had written his own white liberal Southern confession rather than anything that approached Turner's motives, convictions, and interior struggles. To be fair, it is not entirely Styron's fault that the media and the conservative mainstream artistic community had lauded his novel and positioned him as an authentic scribe of Negro male psychology and historical experience. Had he not received so much attention and been hailed as a true, insightful perceiver, his document and his historical methodology would have probably received little attention from Black people, but his accolades mirrored too closely the violent racial reality of the 1960s. That same year, 1968, Columbia, the university that administered the Pulitzer, acted in a racially prejudiced manner toward the Black Harlem community, moving to violently contain student civil disobedience efforts. In 1963, a white assassin had gunned down Medgar Evers, the field secretary for the NAACP, in his Mississippi carport. The Nation of Islam, with rumored assistance of the U.S. Secret Service, had assassinated Malcolm X in 1965. That same year, a 6-day insurrection began in the Watts section of Los Angeles. Amid this national furor, Styron's novel and notoriety led to the resurrection of the most contentious and racially charged aspects of Turner's legacy. In November of 1968, Styron received a letter from Robert B. Franklin in Elkhart, Indiana, describing how he had come to possess Turner's missing skull, saying, "I have in my possession a skull," he begins, "which I believe to be that of Nat Turner. The skull was given to me by my father, who inherited it from his. My grandfather was a doctor who practiced in Richmond, Virginia around the turn of the century. The skull was given to him by a female patient whose name is not known. She claimed to have gotten it from her father, who was a physician in attendance when Nat Turner was executed." Turner's missing skull had long been a sore spot for Black people living in and outside of the Southampton, Virginia community. The beheading of Turner coincided with the boiling down of his flesh and the use of his skin parts to make the notorious money purse. Franklin's letter to Styron only confirmed long-standing Black suspicions that whites had literally and socially consumed Turner's body. Whether or not Franklin actually possessed Nat Turner's skull, a fact that today remains unproven by medical science, his safeguarding of the skull and treating it like a cherished family heirloom demonstrates that well into the late 20th century, the possession of Turner's cannibalized body had social and historic significance for whites. This issue of whites consuming Turner's body influenced late 19th and mid 20th century Black resistance communities and their practices. The 19th century question of Turner's consumption reared its ugly head in the 20th century in a way that redefined the issue of Black consumption under slavery and lent an even greater import to the disappearance of Turner's body. In the 1960s, such concerns took on a political edge that is documented in the above-mentioned 10 Black Writers Respond. Apart from its critique of Styron's novel, 10 Black Writers Respond is a singular historical and cultural document that is a touchstone for the numerous debates that surrounded the novel. I intend to address Styron's novel shortly. Before analyzing the novel, though, I want to spend a bit of time on the 10 Black Writers Respond, because the range of activist, scholarly, and psychological perspectives contained therein provides a frame for my later readings of homoeroticism and consumption during slavery. The individuals published in 10 Black Writers Respond help us understand how time and memory altered the cannibalism debates that I present in earlier chapters. And they also clarified how more contemporary language of consumption and same-sex eroticism evolved from slavery-era debates about cannibalism. The subject of cannibalism during slavery was difficult for Black people to talk about in the 1960s. In some respects, even more difficult than it was for Black people who lived through slavery. This difficulty had in part to do with Turner's dismemberment, his missing skull, and the coveted money purse made out of his skin, and the fact that he never received a complete burial. Moreover, this torture and social consumption of Turner constituted an unresolved realm of racial trauma that Black men had not yet begun to forthrightly address. In an essay from 10 Black Writers Respond, The Failure of William Styron, Ernest Kaiser chastises Styron for writing an article that gives the explicit details about cooking and consuming Turner's flesh, saying, "Examples of bestial descriptions in his article," writes Kaiser, "are his unnecessary, gruesome explanations that the doctor skinned Nat Turner's dead body after he was hanged along with 17 other Negroes and made grease of his flesh, and the lurid details on his novel of the killings of whites by Negroes." Kaiser spoke for most of the Black men in the edited collection who simply could not bear such descriptions of Turner, which they claimed violated Turner in body as well as in cherished memory. In a moving letter to Harriet Tubman in 1868, Frederick Douglass described a domain of African American memory reserved only for the most hallowed, self-sacrificing revolutionaries. Frederick Douglass writes, "Excepting John Brown of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable to those who do not know you as I know you." For Douglass, that makes John Brown sacred in his commitment, his sacrifice, and his willingness to die for Black liberty. But remember, John Brown was ostracized from the white community. He wanted to be a part of the ruling elite. He didn't have that opportunity to, and so then he sided with the Black people, and then out of spite. In his 1907 biography on Douglass, Booker T. Washington also invoked the idea of sacred memory, seeing in Douglass the noble embodiment of all Black struggles during slavery. The life of Frederick Douglass is the history of American slavery epitomized in a single human experience. He saw it all, lived it all, and overcame it all. In Douglass, Washington saw what was greatest in the race as well as the potential for a higher destiny. It was this spirit of commitment to the sacred memory of Turner that inspired the distinguished activist and scholar John Henrik Clarke to compile and edit 10 Black Writers Respond. The idea was to hold persons such as Brown and Turner in their best light, to emphasize the aspects of their lives that could inspire and ennoble future generations. In his introduction to the collection, Clarke emphasizes the connection between the sacred memory of Turner and the political climate of the 1960s. He says, "The contributors of this book collectively maintain that the distortion of the true character of Nat Turner was deliberate. The motive for this distortion could be William Styron's reaction to the radical climate that has prevailed in the United States in the last 15 years." Clark goes on to position H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, two Black Power proponents, as direct descendants of Turner's legacy. Some of the titles of the essay compiled in the anthology reveal the feelings of sacred and personal relationship and personal ownership Black men associated with Turner's memory. Vincent Harding's You've Taken My Nat and Gone, Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Nat's Last White Man, and Charles V. Hamilton's Our Nat Turner and William Styron's Creation are examples. So it was a complicated situation and relationship, but Dr. Clark was trying to do it justice and give a Black response to this book that got so much critical acclaim from white men, which was a marketing genius idea, because why not make and enrich some Black people off of this white man's notoriety, right? Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. The image of Turner as consumed by whites did not fit into this earlier model of sacred Black heroic figures. In his analysis cited earlier, Kaiser links the cannibalization of Turner to emasculation, effeminacy, and larger moral issues confronting the nation. He points out how Styron's argument builds upon the fundamental and untenable thesis of Frank Tannenbaum and Stanley M. Elkins, which was that American slavery was so oppressive, despotic, and emasculating psychologically that revolt was impossible and Negroes could only be Sambos. Styron has admitted in an interview that the text that most influenced his thinking about slavery as an institution and the slave's psychology was Elkins's Slavery. Kaiser briefly entertains the issue of cannibalism in the white author's writing, only to point out how lurid, bestial, and morally wrong are Styron's perspectives. Kaiser remarks reveal how Black people repressed and did not discuss certain painful issues, such as the issue of human consumption. It was painful for Blacks to strategically it was painful for Blacks and strategically risky to publicly broach subjects that might add fuel to white misconceptions and attempts to emasculate Black men in the past and the present. Only 20 years earlier, ethnologist Melvin J. Herskovits had published The Myth of the Negro Past in 1941, a way of refuting strongly held beliefs that the Negro had no cultural legacy, came from a land of heathens and cannibals, and actually benefited from his bondage in America. Styron's novel proved that for many whites, all of the revised Black history and documented anthropological proof in the world could not dissuade them from the idea that the African was innately ignorant and destined to be subservient to the white male. Kaiser paraphrases Gertrude Wilson of the New York Amsterdam News, who explained the connections between Styron's confessions and contemporary racial apartheid in the following manner. The book is so popular with whites because it proves that if Negroes retaliate against injustice by violence, they will be quelled by violence. The book also gives, she says, the blessing of history for continued violence against Negroes. The rampant church bombings, lynchings, and assassinations of the 1960s supported Wilson's assertions. Styron's novel only exacerbated the myths and social fictions that fueled this institutionalized violence against African American persons. Redo 9002 said, they did their best with such evocative titles. Yes, they did. I mean, they implied what they could not say. Even if they did write the truth, it wouldn't have been printed. Exactly. Even if they wrote the truth, it wouldn't have been printed. Equating Black consumption with homosexuality. Kaiser's unwillingness to talk about the topic of cannibalism did not make it any less relevant to or have less impact of an impact on all of the 10 Black men who responded to Styron's novel. In fact, what happened as a result of the compounded pain of the past and the threat of social consumption and racial annihilation in the present was that Black men approached discussions of Styron's novel in order to liberate the voice of the people and at the same time reinforce historical silences. So, what he's saying here is that Black men came out of the woodwork to shut him up about homoeroticism and cannibalism during enslavement because they knew the truth. Their general approach tended to diminish the emotional aspects of their masculinity, foregrounding a negative image of homosexuality, and left the issues of white consumption and Black self consumption to fester in the Black imagination and soul. The 10 Black contributors coupled cannibalism, both overtly and covertly, with homoeroticism and effeminacy. For these Black men, homoeroticism became a way of circumventing and projecting their experiences and pain onto certain effeminate Black men. The consumed Black man these Black men equated with the homosexual man. Homosexuality served as a means of containing certain unwieldy and historically difficult topics pertaining to Black masculinity, such as the need for intimacy, gender variance, sexual and emotional vulnerability, and violation. If it was as if, in this very powerful and discursive moment, threads that had been all along winding through history wove together in a manner that illuminated the past as much as they clouded and blocked full access to its complicated meaning. So remember, this book was edited heavily by a white male queer liberal person. And this might have been a question on Vincent Woodward's mind, especially because he was writing this as he was dying. It doesn't say what he died of. But you have to remember that the question that they're asking here is, how did homosexuality or queer Black men, right, reconcile cannibalism and heterosexuality at the time? Because as they were writing this story, what he's saying is that it illuminated or it highlighted some of the things that they talked about in the past, such as cannibalism and sexual violation, but they didn't talk about the fact that Black men wanted intimacy because that was seen as effeminate and gay. Vincent Harding, in distinction from the other 9 authors, foregrounds the connection between the consumption of Turner and the contemporary consumption of Black men. Rather than chastising Styron for speaking about Turner's cannibalization as Kaiser does, Harding openly accuses Styron of attempting to cannibalize Turner. Now, this is precisely what William Styron fails to do with the world and the words of Nat Turner. He has been unable to eat and digest the blackness, the fierce religious conviction, the power of the man. Harding draws upon the antebellum legacy of the Black heroic figure as impermeable, steeled, and inviolate to prove his point. It is Turner's power and driveness, his liberating truth, that makes him impervious to the jaws and appetites of whites, those who have neither eaten nor mourned. Harding writes the truth. Styron's Turner appealed to the general media, to highbrow, white, literate communities, and to institutions that awarded and sanctioned literary greatness. Styron's Turner appealed to white desires for a palatable Black radical figure, diminished in all of his complexity and transhistorical powers. Harding's thinking about Black male consumption reflected traditional models of Black male virility, literacy, and enlightened consciousness. The counterpoint to the virile, powerful figure in Harding's essay, and in most of the essays the other Black men wrote, was the effeminate, homosexual, and therefore emasculated Black man. Where radical individuals such as Turner, Martin Luther King Jackson, and Martin Luther King Jr. and George Jackson could not be eaten. The assumption was that, like Luke, who was a raped Black man depicted in the Harriet Jacobs slave narrative, a James L. Smith or contemporary James Baldwin could be consumed. Harding's discussion of homosexuality in the novel begins with Brantley, a social outcast among whites, and a personally repulsive homosexual whose speciality seems to be the molesting of young boys. Brantley is, in Harding's view, the typical white male parasite of the parasitic master-slave relationship. It is disturbing in Harding that Styron alone chose to create such a pariah-like personality for the one white man who is drawn to Nat Turner's religious teachings. This is a perfect example of Styron's attempt to make palatable the fierce religious conviction of the heroic Black figure. Styron's use of homosexuality and Christian-sanctioned incest to turn Turner into a consumable object. In the previous chapter, I discussed how there is an undercurrent of historical truth to this dynamic between Black men and white men during slavery. It would have been, of course, inappropriate for Harding in his defensive posture to invoke this history. It would only have added grist to the white mill of consumption he was attempting to deconstruct. Still, his easy conflation of homosexuality with consumption and Black male virility and power with immunity to consumption perpetuates silences and unspeakable domains of Black male experience extending back to slavery. I intend to discuss these more thoroughly, but for the moment, let us explore more deeply how other Black writers and Clark's compilation perpetuate Harding's correlation of homosexuality, emasculation, and sexual taint. Loyal Hairston also equated emasculation with homosexuality. William Styron writes, Hairston triumphantly reduces his slave to a religious celibate, a kind of self-castration. Poor Nat Turner's only sexual experience is, alas, a homosexual one? Lerone Bennett Jr. accuses Styron of emasculating Nat Turner by depicting him as an impotent, sex-crazed celibate who masturbates every Saturday in the carpenter shop, and as one who has homosexual encounter and a detailed white fantasy life. Concurring with Bennett, psychologist Alvin F. Poussaint offers further insights into Styron's psychological motivations. And this is one of the few things that I've read by Poussaint, but he's much like, oh my goodness, the other guy that's always saying that it's Black people's fault that we are, I'll think of his name later, but you know who I'm talking about. He wrote Rednecks. He wrote a couple of other books, but you know who I'm talking about. The other Black coon that talks about the fact that Black people can uplift themselves. But this is going to be interesting. I think Styron's selection of quote unquote factual and psychological materials speaks for itself. It speaks for itself again when we read that the closest our Black rebel comes to a realized sexual experience is through a homosexual one with another young Black slave. What is the communication here? Naturally, it implies that Turner was not a man at all. It suggests that he was unconsciously really feminine. Wasn't Nat Turner married? Didn't he have a whole wife? Wasn't there some conflict there? So why are they bringing up this homosexual experience that he might have had in this fictionalized story? From these and other observations, there emerges a complicated picture of homosexuality as understood in this context. We could begin with just the use of the word homosexual. Most Black men in the collection used the word homosexual, which had no currency during the antebellum period, to describe Styron's Turner, while Styron himself does not actually use the word in his novel. The use of the words speaks to a conflation of historical time periods, the conflation of 20th century psychological discourses of sexual deviancy and same-sex behavior in all of its variations in the context of slavery. On the one hand, the use of the word homosexual conveys a lack of historical consciousness and historical specificity on the part of the Black men. So homosexuality wasn't a thing during antebellum enslavement, and using that word to describe male love or sexual relationships is kind of inadequate. But they were writing from a 20th century perspective so that the readers could understand why they were so upset about what Styron was saying. So they used the language of the day to convey the ideas that were being expressed in another text that was written in the language of yesterday. On the other hand, this word, as a reflection of 1960s racial politics, does accurately convey how the legacy of slavery fed into contemporary understandings of homosexuality in the context of Black experience. In the minds of many of these men, the state was a virile, predatory white man that had long preyed upon and sought to instill in Black men an effeminate sexual availability. Late 20th century scholars of sexuality, responding to the use of the words homosexual, faggot, and effeminate by the Black male writers, have tended to refer to this group as homophobic or as maintaining homophobic assumptions. This easy conflation of the past with present, an effeminate man during slavery with a homosexual man in the present, reflects the extent to which this historical era marked yet another recalibration of the meaning and application of the history of slavery. Correct, because just because a man was effeminate during enslavement doesn't mean that he would have been a homosexual man today, because perhaps he was soft like that because he needed to survive the encounter. Ron Eierman writes in Cultural Trauma, Slavery and the Formation of African American Identity that 20 to 30 years individuals that every 20 to 30 years, individuals look back and reconstruct a traumatic past. One could plot the publication of Styron's novel, The Assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and the publication of 10 Black Writers Respond on a 20-year cycle dating from the Emancipation Proclamation. The year 1965 marks the 50th year, the fifth 20-year cycle following the end of slavery, or the 100-year anniversary of emancipation. At stake for so many Black people were not just the historical facts of the experience, but also the power to control and interpret the meaning and historical significance of the legacy of slavery. Poussin and others made extensive references to historical texts about slavery written by white men. Herbert Aptheker, America's Negro Slave Revolts, is an exemplary text for its ample depiction of the spirit and practice of revolt that pervaded slave life. Many Black persons considered Thomas A. Bailey's The American Pageant, A History of the Republic, a prejudicial text that infantilized and diminished Turner's contributions. Most of the Black men considered Stanley M. Elkins's Slavery a text that directly informed Styron's Portrait of Turner to be a strongly white-influenced text, even though Elkins was African American. More than anything, Black men and women felt strongly compelled to protect the image of the Black family, Black masculinity, and Black motherhood and womanhood. I wonder why he didn't add Black womanhood there, but womanhood as sustained in the context of slavery. Within this recreated and imagined context, there was no room for a complicated understanding of homoeroticism during slavery. In her critique of Styron's novel, Alice Walker emphasized how Styron depicted Turner as loving a white woman, and how he uses homosexuality to strip Turner of his revolutionary spirit and power. She writes, "A slave revolutionary who revolts simply because he cannot have the woman he loves, if he loves her, and there is no proof that Nat loved anybody white, denies that there was anything about slavery itself to make him revolt. Revolts are made, but rarely from the love of one adolescent enemy female whom one lovingly stabs and then beats over the head with a fence post until she is dead. Besides, if Nat were really a homosexual, as Mr. Styron implies, why should he bother?" June Meyer, who is better known as June Jordan, interpreted the confessions as an attack on Turner's masculinity and that of Black men in general. In her 1967 review published in The Nation, she wrote, There is a man who exists as one of the most popular objects of leadership and legislation and quasi literature in the history of all men. There lives a man who is spoken for, imagined, feared, criticized, pitied, misrepresented, fought against, reviled, and loved, primarily on the basis of secondhand information or worse. Meyer's review speaks of the long-standing, systematic use and consumption of the Black male. Meyer critiques both Styron and those who favorably reviewed his novel for taking Turner out of context, depicting him as disconnected from Black family and community. The Black women and men who reviewed the confessions overtly and covertly assumed a relationship within the Black family during slavery and Black male virility. Sex and gender, they also conflated with homosexuality, made out to equal effeminacy. Many Blacks linked homosexuality to castration, and the recent history of Black men who had been lynched and Black women who had been raped in the Jim Crow South and in the North. Homosexuality, in its metaphoric power, had an exhaustive function. It is equated with the absence of family, the hatred of Black people, estrangement from one's kin and culture, and all of those horrific aspects of Black experience about which Black people would rather not speak. On the surface, at least, I do not disagree with these Black men and women. I think their analysis regarding historicity, and the diminishment of Black communal ties was mostly correct. Styron's novel was historically inaccurate, depicting Turner as raised by whites rather than Black parents and a grandmother Turner spoke about in his original confessions. Styron depicts aspects of Turner's sexual life that are not validated in any documentation coming from the time period, and Styron's exhaustive probing into the racial hatred and self-hatred of Nat Turner clearly reflected something in his own psyche and white identity that he felt compelled to project onto Turner. Black men were put on the defensive by both the novel and the institutions, literary production, and the media, and individuals who supported Styron as an authentic interpreter of the Black historical experience. Many Black men, like Bennett, felt that Styron was waging a literary war that paralleled the contemporary political and police state war against Black men, saying, "He wages literary war on this Nat Turner's image, substituting an impotent, cowardly, irresolute creature of his own imagination for the real Black man who killed and ordered killed real white people for historical reasons." In such embattled situations, Black people have had to historically adopt strategic postures. They had to adopt a perspective of themselves, the race, and their history that white people could not just eat and digest. That was the irony of this moment. Black people invoked the cannibal discourse that could have freed up and complicated Black male perspectives on everything from social consumption to homoeroticism, only to defend Black masculinity and Black culture. Black men were not interested in, nor capable of, dealing with the complex legacy of cannibalism and homoeroticism that so powerfully shaped their responses to Styron's novel. One Black man did have a fairly clear and nuanced understanding of the danger and potential of this moment. James Baldwin. Indeed, Baldwin predicted that Styron's novel would be a storm center. In an interview for Newsweek, he acknowledged, "It'll be called effrontery. Bill's going to catch it from black and white. It's a very courageous book that attempts to fuse the two points of view, the masters and the slaves. It's important for the Black reader to see what Bill is trying to do and to recognize its validity. What could a white man who depicted one of our strong Black heroic figures who has myth-making status and potential, right? What could a white man do with making us think that this Black man was gay or had white lust or wanted sex with a white woman? What was his point? What is the validity of that? In preparation for his novel, Styron read Baldwin's writings because they were friends and they were gay together, and spoke extensively with the Black author about the Black experience. Styron credited Baldwin with breaking down his greatest racial prejudices. Jimmy broke down the last shred of whatever final hang-up of Southern prejudice I might have had, which was trying to tell me that a Negro was never really intelligent. Baldwin encouraged Styron, which might partially explain why he was not invited to contribute to 10 Black Men Respond. Generally speaking, Black people felt confused by and disapproved of Baldwin's support of Styron, and I stand by that statement because I disapprove of him trying to protect this white man and project some image of impartiality that he has because this white man is his friend. As part of his response to Styron, Harding also critiqued Baldwin. Harding's comments to Baldwin began to broach an area that was largely unexplored in the national debate, and that is the feelings, emotions, secret, and common history that Styron's novel brought up for Black men in relation to one another. Harding, in so many words, refers to Baldwin as a race traitor when he says, "Nevertheless, as with all tragedy, the deepest level is to be found within us, Black us." And it was perhaps symbolized by one of our most important artists, James Baldwin. For it was Baldwin who praised his friend's work highly, Baldwin who saw himself in Styron's Turner, and Baldwin who dared to say, "This is the beginning of our common history." In the Newsweek interview, Baldwin actually refers to Styron as constructing our common history. Harding strongly disagreed with this statement. Surely, it is nothing of the kind. In spite of Baldwin's largest, kindest hopes, Styron has done nothing less and nothing more than create another chapter in our long and common agony. He has done it because we have allowed it, and we, who are Black, must be men enough to admit the bitter fact. There can be no common history until we first have fleshed out the lineaments of our own, for no one else can speak of the bittersweet bowels of our Blackness. The fact that Baldwin, in a most iconic and painful way, was right. Styron, I think, rather unconsciously, wrote out of a shared historical consciousness of slavery. And part of the disavowal and swearing off of this tie by Harding and other Black men had to do with the Black men being neither ready nor able to face the painful legacy of objectification, incest, infantilization between master patriarch and slave. Black men were not ready to look at how their institutional consumption in the 1960s originated in slavery, old processes of cannibalization. So many powerful, unexamined emotions, such as hatred, love, desire, and need, undergirded the historical relationship between Black men and white men. I don't say that these types of relationships didn't exist. I say that these types of relationships were under duress because, again, Black men may have used an effeminate manner as a mechanism for survival. I also say that Styron was wrong to use Nat Turner as his example because, in using Nat Turner as the example of this Black male effeminate character, he was tearing down a giant. So, did he really get rid of the remnants of his white racial hate and misunderstanding of Black people? Did he really get rid of his Southern liberal perspectives? Or was he just hiding them and playing a game with James Baldwin, who was flirting with some of the sexual desires that he had for this white man? I'm just asking. I feel like that's a valid question. A Slave Kiss. I'll now turn to the novel as a vehicle for exploring this issue of common history, as Baldwin conceived of it through Styron's text. Rather than dealing with Black-white homoerotic dynamics, I want to examine a scene in the novel that deals with same-sex eroticism between two young Black men. Fictional book, remember. Nat Turner and his boyhood friend, Willis. The riverside scene in The Confessions of Nat Turner is a tender, disturbing, and complex depiction of Black male need and desire. I say this knowing full well that Black scholars at the time expressed feelings of disgust and betrayal about this scene. They referred to it simply as masturbation, homosexuality, and a depiction of Nat Turner as a homosexual. We are introduced to Willis as an orphan. His mother dies from a lung complaint, which brings the youth to the attention of one of Turner's former masters. In his depiction of Willis as motherless and fatherless, Styron, who failed on many historical counts, captured a true reality of slavery. So many young Black boys during slavery found themselves without mother and father as a result of the auction block, disease, and violence. And let's not forget lies, because a lot of them white men fathered children with Black women and then used those children as chattels. They paid college students to impregnate our women, right? To forcibly have sex with them and paid them money to do so for every woman they impregnated. So, yes, this happened. Nat observes Willis working and is enraptured by something irresistible in the youth, his gaiety, his innocent open disposition, his song that accompanies his work. In the novel, in the novel, Turner describes Willis as a slim, beautiful boy with fine-boned features, very gentle and wistful in his pose, and the light glistened like oil on his smooth black skin. This is a totally fictionalized account of what Nat Turner said, talked about, highlighted during his days before lynching. But this is what this white man imagined in his mind. And then Vincent Woodward might have had something to say about this, but then this white liberal queer person is highlighting this fact, right, from the text. Ever since meeting Willis, Turner had worked diligently to convert the heathen Willis to the truth of Christian belief. Willis believes in omens and conjuring. He wears a mojo or a fetish of his own construction. Willis has decorated his mojo fetish with the long hairs from the cock bull that had died of the bloat. He had tied up 3 fuzzy patches on his head to ward off ghosts. The fangs of a water moccasin he wore on a string around his neck, a charm against fever. This scene has an eerie historical familiarity. This relationship between the Black enlightened subject and the Black heathen, the decorous, literate speech of Turner contrasting against the guileless, obscene ways of the folk. Frederick Douglass constructs a similar dynamic between himself and Sandy, who was a root-working Black elder. He refers to Sandy and all slaves who believe in conjure like Sandy as the more ignorant slave. In his preparatory research for his novel, Styron read the slave narrative of Frederick Douglass and numerous others, and it could have very well been from Douglass's narrative or that of another slave that Styron first gleaned an understanding of this dynamic between enlightened and heathen slave. Returning to the text, Turner and Willis sit at the riverside one weekend fishing and enjoying each other's company. Both boys typically went fishing together on Saturdays and Sundays. This particular weekend will change the course of their relationship and history itself. This is the fateful weekend when they will kiss and masturbate one another. Shortly after their arrival, Willis pricks his finger with a hook or the sharp spine of a fish. Instinctively, he cries out, "Fucking Jesus!" Turner, a devout Christian with a missionary's zeal, swiftly rapped him across the lips, drawing a tiny runnel of blood. Turner punctuates the act by proclaiming to the shocked Willis, "A filthy mouth is an abomination to the Lord." Turner's violent response to Willis calls to mind 19th century Black missionaries who traveled all the way back to Africa to civilize and save so-called African heathens from extinction. Black culture has been, if anything, a long uphill battle against the heathen without and within. Styron exploited this theme for his own ends, but there is still the truth at the heart of this scenario, a truth made more complicated and disturbing when intermingled with the theme of homosexuality. After Turner strikes Willis, a whirlwind of emotions grips the two. Willis affects a broken, hurt look. Turner is in turn overcome with emotion. Styron writes for Turner, "I felt a pang of guilt and pain of anger at my anger, and a rush of pity swept through me. mingled with a hungry tenderness that stirred me in a way I have never known. This hunger and rush of feelings gives way to touch and forbidden warmth. Turner describes Willis's eyes as brimming with tears, then flashes onto the moccasin fangs gangling at his neck, bone white and startling against his shiny, bare black chest. I reach up to wipe the blood away from his lips, pulling him near with the feel of his shoulders slippery beneath my hand. And then we somehow fell on each other, very close, soft and comfortable, in a sprawl like babies. Beneath my exploring fingers, his hot skin throbbed and pulsed like the throat of a pigeon, and I heard him sigh in a faraway voice. And then, for a long moment, as if set free into another land, we did our hands together what before I had done alone. Never had I known that human flesh could be so sweet. What else are we supposed to think this man is saying after writing of a homosexual jerk off, right, between two teenage boys? And what type of mind? But this is the mind of their culture. You have to remember, pedophilia is a part of their culture, and this is just another expression of pedophilia. But why would he put this in the book? To destroy Nat Turner's memory. Because someone could read that, not knowing that there's an older version of the Confessions of Nat Turner, because he took the title of the original book, and they would assume that this is what Nat Turner said. Willis is Africa in the flesh. He is the African infant compared to Turner, who plays the role of the enlightened paternal Negro, a type of New World Black missionary. Styron depicts homoeroticism as a complex affair shaped in part by discourses of African eroticization, Negro socialization, and Christian indoctrination. As I mentioned earlier, Black reviewers and commentators accuse Styron of eroticizing and further indoctrinating Black men in this scene. Poussin read this scene as the psychological disfigurement of Turner and, as well, his emasculation. Referring to this Willis Turner scene, he asks, "What is the communication here?" His response, as we have seen, naturally it implies that Nat Turner was not a man at all. Poussin's observations are complicated, for they speak to the homosexuality used in this instance to dislocate Turner from the natal origins and as a tool to get inside of Turner in order to expose the erotic and sexual confusion underlying his revolutionary politics. Styron uses, and I would agree, abuses the idea of homosexuality in this instance. So yes, he agrees that Styron is using this particular representation of homosexuality being expressed in Nat Turner in a useful and abusive way. Styron's depiction of the Willis-Turner dynamic speaks to a historical dialect between Black men dating back to slavery. As mentioned earlier, one can see the seeds of Willis and Turner in Frederick Douglass's depiction of the more African-like, elderly Sandy and himself in his first slave narrative. He describes Sandy as believing in conjure. Sandy takes him out to a wooded area to recover a certain root. which, according to Douglas, would render it impossible for Mr. Covey or any other white man to whip me. As with Turner, it is not the root, according to Douglas, that sets him free, but his life or death struggle against the slave breaker Covey that returns his lost manhood to him. Douglas and Sandy do not actually kiss, but they are nevertheless bound by the very same cord of heathen versus civilized, infantilized versus manly black man that binds Turner to Willis in the novel. The 19th century black religious leader Alexander Crummell thought of the African heathen as licentious, someone to be civilized off the face of the planet. In essays and speeches, he imagined the African heathen as seductive, wielding the same power and sinful allure that Willis wields over Nat. W.E.B. Du Bois, a protege of Crummell, described the Negro of the South as tainted with African beliefs and heathen practices. So you see, there's this class consciousness because these civilized Negroes that have been fully indoctrinated by the Christian doctrine and have a revelation of a white man's God through a book that is older than slavery and older than the Christianity that it espouses, feel like they are the ones that have to civilize these heathens and get rid of root workers and conjure men and conjure women. The Negro has already been pointed out many times as a religious animal, a being of that deep emotional nature which turns instinctively toward the supernatural. He called up all the resources of hedonism to aid: exorcism and witchcraft, the mysterious Obi worship with its barbarous rites, spells, and blood sacrifice, even now and then, of human victims. Weird midnight orgies and mystic conjurations were involved. The witch woman and the voodoo priest became the center of Negro group life, and that vein of vague superstition which characterizes the unlettered Negro even today was deepened and strengthened. Du Bois romanticizes and even eroticizes the very Black folk that he seeks to liberate from the emotional and spiritual clutches of American history. As a lettered Negro, Du Bois's experiences and sense of self are counterbalanced by the heathen sensibility contained in the body and social practices of the unlettered Negro. Talented 10th. Du Bois feels seduced by and is at the same time repulsed by this Negro, whom he describes as bloodthirsty, sexually licentious, massive, and erotically overpowering, and even cannibalistic in his urges and rituals. In his review of Claude McKay's novel, Home to Harlem, written in 1928, Du Bois more explicitly coupled his idea of something heathen in the folk with homosexuality and sexual abandon in artistic culture of the Harlem Renaissance. Such evidence at least hints at something much deeper than the offense taking that characterizes Black people's knee-jerk response to the Willis Turner scene in Styron's novel. Perhaps a deeper fear of recognition is operating for a real acknowledgement of something essentially Black in the Willis Turner dynamic would necessitate a rethinking of constructs such as the color line and the problematics such as the Negro problem as having been, from their inceptive moments, imbricated with the Black homoerotic discourse. Blah, blah, blah. What he's talking about and saying is that maybe in this Black on Black homosexual experience, there's something inherently Black about it, and that Black men had this desire and this drive for other Black men during that time that has carried over to the modern era. No, this is a fictionalized account that a white man came up with to express and denigrate a Black hero. I don't know why we're going over this in such detail, because that's the answer, right? Right. I think this might have been some of what Baldwin was trying to get at through the double implications of our common history. Where others saw void and absence, nothing of nation, community, or of the Black self in homoeroticism, Baldwin saw homoeroticism as being, in some ways, most representative of racial experience. An example from Baldwin's book-length essay, No Name in the Street, illustrates this point. Baldwin has come from a self-imposed exile in Paris to the U.S. South to observe and report on the civil rights conditions there. He interviews children who are integrating schools and their family members, Black ministers, white sheriffs, and governors, among other persons in each city he travels to. At one point in his observations, at a loss for examples to explain the incestuous thread that binds white men to Black men in the South, Baldwin relates the experience of being sexually groped by a drunken white state official. I realized that I was being groped by one of the most powerful men in one of the states I visited. He had got himself sweating drunk in order to arrive at this despairing titillation. With his wet eyes staring up at my face and his wet hands groping my cock, we were both abruptly in history's ass pocket. It was frightening, not the gesture itself, but the abjectness of it. The broader implications of this secret desire for Black male flesh, Black male cock, are that Black people in the South are at the mercy of men such as this, who pull and press the levers that run Jim Crow machinery. This white man was one of the men you called or had called friend in order to get your brother off the prison farm. A phone call from him might prevent your brother from being dug up later during some random archaeological expedition. Baldwin demonstrates how homosexual desire is seamlessly intertwined with the legacy of American slavery and Black civil identity in the South. It was even conceivable to him that were it not for the migration of Black men out of the South after emancipation, the entire region might have become an absolutely homosexual community wherein white male desire for Black men was more open and socially acceptable. There is a fluid correlation in Baldwin's mind between this white man reaching for his cock and the castration of Black men in the context of lynching rituals, the Black exercise of the right to vote, school integration, and the over-incarceration of Black men on chain gangs and in jails. Baldwin's sexual counters the idea that if Black men were doing the fucking of a white man, then this manhood remained intact and he could be considered revolutionary, a notion that many Black power advocates silently entertained. State-sanctioned racial oppression, as this scenario demonstrates, pairs well with homoeroticism. The homosexual oppression of Black men overlaps with and feeds seamlessly into larger systems of racial oppression. And to say just a bit more about the sexual implications of this scene, just because the white man was reaching for Baldwin's penis does not mean that the man sought sexual penetration. He may have wanted to penetrate Baldwin. He may have wanted oral gratification one way or the other. I could speculate endlessly about the sexual particulars of this scenario. But what we know for sure is that Baldwin himself finally clarifies, which is that it is absolutely certain that white men who invented the nigger's big black prick are still at the mercy of this nightmare and are still, for the most part, doomed in one way or another to attempt to make his prick their own. No matter what form the sex takes, the white man's power will not be compromised. Having access to big black prick, Baldwin infers, is constructive of the state-sanctioned power of the white official that he encounters. A number of scholars have experienced frustration at Baldwin's slippery relationship to and outright rejection of a homosexual identity and politics. However, this excerpt from No Name in the Street clarifies how Baldwin sees homosexuality in terms of the Black experience and Black male identity formation as buried or methodologically disguised in racial logic, in the history of slavery, and in the psychological frameworks of the Southern racial ideology. For Baldwin, homosexuality does not and cannot ever exist as something isolated from racial formation. Brian R. Washington, agreeing with this last statement, notes that in Baldwin's writing an overarching cosmology of race and sex, Blackness and homosexuality are not simply coterminous, they are virtually interchangeable. The encounter between himself and the white official helps us better understand why Baldwin would support Styron's freedom to imagine and inhabit Nat Turner and all of the lurid homosexual implications of that habitation. For how else were the unspeakable fantasies and suppressed homosexual desires of Southern white men going to be exposed and potentially exercised? This subtle level of discourse was lost upon and completely ignored in the prevailing Black commentary and debates that centered on Styron's novel. There was the general opinion that Styron was constructing a white Southern neo-slave master's version of Black American history. Most viewed James Baldwin's contention that Styron was constructing our common history as at best a misguided perception and at worst as white apologist sentiment. Still, there is a solid ethos informing Baldwin's statement. As a Black homosexual who was not afraid to speak publicly about being groped by a white man, Baldwin occupied a unique position that allowed him to understand how desire and sexuality transcended and confounded racial thinking. In his essay, Down at the Cross, Letter from a Region in My Mind, Baldwin refers to whites and Blacks as having to come together as lovers in order to achieve America's loftiest ideals and transcend the prison of racial ideology, where he says, everything now we must assume is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country. That's an interesting perspective because Baldwin, although he was homosexual, was saying that if we all come together and hold hands, we can achieve this America that we dream about, this America that has been mythologized, this America that is lionized and talked about. And I don't necessarily believe that that's true. For Black men, the problem with this idea of lovers, in particular homoerotic lovers in Styron's novel, was not so much the image of homoeroticism, but the twisted spectral pleasure that whites took in Styron's depictions of Black sexuality. Killings from 10 Black Men Respond likened the white review community journals and the Pulitzer Prize Committee itself to whoremongers. Recording his feeling after reading a review of the novel in the New York Times Review of Books, he writes, I had this uncomfortable feeling that a hoax was being perpetrated against the American reading public. I also had the uneasy feeling, even worse, that the reading public dearly loved it, like a whore being brutally ravished and loving every masochistic minute of it. Killings had justification for feeling the way that he did. In the 1930s, psychologists and sexologists from Sigmund Freud to Richard Kraft Ebing documented that some Europeans achieved sexual arousal through romanticized images of slaves. Kraft Ebing, who coined the term masochism, includes in his compendium on sexual pathology the following letter from a self-diagnosed masochist, case 57, who says, even in my early childhood, I loved to revel in ideas about the absolute mastery of one man over others. The thought of slavery had something exciting in it for me. Alike, whether from the standpoint of master or servant, that one man could possess, sell, or whip another caused me intense excitement. And in reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I had read at the beginning of puberty, I had erections. So what we discover here in this moment is that white males have a sexual fixation with the purchase, selling, whipping, possessing, the ownership over Black flesh. And it was pathologized by them, and they hide this diagnosis under the broad term masochist. In her study of masochistic desire, Marcia Marcus lists the childhood books that provided materials for her own adolescent masochistic fantasies. What we learn here is that these desire to the eroticization of Black flesh is not limited to the white male. It also spills over to the white female, where she says, there were the books about boarding school in which small boys slaved for the bigger boys. There were the books about the initiation rites of exotic people. There was Uncle Tom's Cabin and other books about slaves in America. From the antebellum period, critiques of Stowe's novel by white Southern men revealed how these men themselves associated sexual license and impurity with the novel and often read into many of the scenes a pornographic subtext. These men, themselves titillated by the novel, wanted to limit and ultimately prevent its distribution. When it came to slavery, the concepts of love, intimacy, and desire between white and black men had for the longest time shot through with violence, with white erotic voyeurism and a precarious politics of white empathy and sentimentalism. Baldwin understood this legacy. He found Stowe's novel, for example, to be riddled with sentimentality, the type of sentimentality that was an excuse for violent inhumanity, the mask of cruelty, what made objects of the slave among both abolitionists and plantation workers. Baldwin even goes as far back as to link Richard Wright's Bigger Thomas with Stowe's Tom, asserting that Bigger is Tom's descendant, flesh of his flesh. So exactly opposite a portrait that, when the books are placed together, it seems the contemporary Negro novelist and the dead New England woman are locked together in a deadly, timeless battle. Bigger Thomas rapes a white woman and obsesses over white femininity as a symbol and prize. Stowe, on the other hand, obsesses over black male virility while domesticating it, packaging it, and emotionally mastering it so as to ward off the unspoken threat of the black beast, the rapist. Baldwin understood how this legacy of black men fixated upon either white women or white men had prevented black men from developing more complex models of masculinity and of black male sexuality. For 10 black men respond was just that, a response to white representations of and appetites for blackness. It was a black man who primarily engaged with white men and white institutional structures at the expense of a more private, long overdue discussion of these same issues among black men. Styron's novel presented Baldwin with the perfect opportunity to publicize and mediate the subject of homoerotic connection between black and white men and among men during slavery, and among black men during slavery. In a Newsweek interview, Baldwin acknowledged his identification with Styron's Turner. Yes, he admitted, I think there's some of me in Nat Turner. If I were an actor, I could play the part. Baldwin would have cause to rethink this statement when months later he served as mediator when blacks protested against efforts in Hollywood to make Styron's novel into a film. This statement is loaded with double meaning. It can be read, as many black men read it, that Baldwin was something of a template for Styron's Turner. It also reads as a gesture towards revising the slave past. Baldwin, as a person and symbol, impressed upon black people in this moment the possibility of an entirely different script of revolutionary masculinity during slavery. This statement clarifies how the term our common history referred to Black-white relations on the surface and beneath the surface. It repressed and denied historical presence of the Black homosexual in a genealogy of Black radicalism extending back to slavery. Needless to say, Black men received Baldwin's speech and actions across a great divide. While he envisioned a new radical genealogy and pushed, through Styron, for a model of antebellum resistance that included homoeroticism, most Black men were still stuck on homosexuality as a derivative of white decadence and as the sexual exploitation of Black people, because that's what it is. Killings, as a representative of this Black constituency, linked white desires to the Black homosexual person. He depicts whites as whoremongers. He effeminizes whites and recuperates in a small way some of the stolen legacy of Black masculinity. He plays upon the Christian dichotomy of the chaste virgin and the filthy whore. Not only is the pristine Black revolutionary virtuous and free of such taint, he is also virile, according to Killen's logic. Hence, the white whore's hunger for and pleasure is taken in the Black male's sexuality in Styron's text. Killen's attempts in this way to recuperate Black masculinity and flip the Christian moral script on the very whites and white institutions that claim an unquestionable moral position. The idea of whoredom definitely struck home and made a powerful point, but it was a point that cut both ways. Within 1960s radical culture, Black men applied the same paradigm of the virgin whore to Black lesbians. Black women who coupled with white men, and Black women who asserted themselves in a myriad of ways by refusing to be dominated by Black men. Killen's representation of white sexual appetites as whoredom carried over as well into descriptions of Black homosexuals as whores, carriers of filth, and race betrayers. It is no coincidence that Cleaver refers to Baldwin and to Negro homosexuals in his Souls on Ice, published the same year as 10 Black Men Respond, as whores and objects of white masochistic desire. He says, many Negro homosexuals acquiescing in this racial death wish are outraged and frustrated because in their sickness, they are unable to have a baby by a white man. The cross they have to bear is that already bending over and touching their toes for a white man, the fruit of their miscegenation is not the little half-white offspring of their dreams, but an increase and unwinding of their nerves. Wow. Wow. So remember when I talked about how the white anus is trying to replace the Black womb in these homosexual relationships? Cleaver was talking about that same phenomena at the time and their desire to actually make an attempt to have offspring. Like the horror of Killeen's imagination, Cleaver describes the Negro homosexual as a sycophant and an automated slave, and one who looks to the white man as his big daddy or pimp in the marketplace of white desire. A number of scholars have noted the significance of Cleaver's comments insofar as they reflected a radical Black ideology that equated homosexuality with a racial death wish. Bearing the weight of such an attack, Baldwin understood better than any other how the white desire, even in the Black radical imagination, had intrinsic ties to the metaphoric and real presence of the Black homosexual. When Killens spoke of white whoredom, he was already and implicitly speaking to a sexual framework in which females and effeminacy were suspect, and in which the Negro homosexual could, at a moment's notice, serve as a substitute for the body and person of the Black female. Long-held assumptions inform Killens and Cleaver's statements. There is the assumption that Black male homosexuality originates in the brutality of slavery. The idea that the Black male phallus is the only true measure and means of racial continuity, and the idea that Black homosexuality is always suspect by virtue of its connection to whiteness. Holding firmly to these assumptions for reasons of political strategy and the desire to forget what Kaiser refers to as the bestial and lurid details of slavery, resulted in the missed opportunity among Black men to speak openly and honestly about their historically charged erotic relations to white men, because they were not passionate. They were trying to survive. It's not like this is like him trying to romanticize Sally Hemings. He's trying to romanticize Black, white, homosexual relationships during enslavement. There was no passion there. The Black person wanted to survive, and the white person had this masochistic sexual arousal desire for the Black flesh, right? And they admit that, and they acknowledge that. But this author and his editor are going deeper into something that didn't exist. Black men also missed the opportunity to talk about homoeroticism, same-sex intimacy, need, love, and desire among themselves. Baldwin did not publicly claim a homosexual identity. In fact, he publicly disavowed the labels of homosexual or gay to define his person and art. When called upon to speak on behalf of the race, Baldwin habitually adopted the voice and posture of the angry, emasculated Black patriarch. Protect your women, a difficult thing to do in a civilization sexually so pathetic that the white man's masculinity depends on a denial of the masculinity of the Blacks. Protect your women in a civilization that emasculates the male and abuses the female, and in which, moreover, the male is forced to depend upon the female's breadwinning power. Baldwin was well aware of the dangers of, indeed the price of a ticket, for trying to synthesize his racial and sexual identities. As Dwight A. McBride points out, his efficacy as a race man was, at least in part, dependent upon limiting his public activism to racial politics. Baldwin calls upon a dynamic within the Black collective conscious that is as old as slavery: the image of the lynched or emasculated Black man and the raped, sexually violated Black woman. This dynamic foreclosed a number of other configurations, such as Black men sexually violated by white men, Black men during slavery who played non-patriarchal roles, and Black men who, for whatever reason, did not sexually reproduce the race. So as you can see, there were many types of Black men during enslavement, just as there are today, with an even more diverse packaging of them. The legacy of Black fathers. Although Baldwin did not claim a homosexual politics, he found himself in a historical moment that desperately needed a politics that linked homosexuality with race and with the legacy of Black male sexual violation and sexualization stemming back to slavery. In the corpus of his work, especially in the texts such as The Fire Next Time, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and No Name in the Street, Baldwin lays some of the groundwork for the sexual politics that was never fully realized in the context of the Black Power movement. Excuse me. The example that I cite earlier of his being sexually fondled by a white state official demonstrated Baldwin organically theorizing out of his sexual subjectivity a politics of abuse and white homosexual desire that had an effect upon the entire race and the cause of the civil rights movement. Because Baldwin saw himself as ultimately a witness to the truth, as one whose most valuable tools were his experience and person, in much of his writing, Baldwin encodes his racial sexual politics in his experience, especially those experiences finely attuned to the intimate, unspoken regions of male intimacy and same-sex eroticism. Differing from the popular homosexual politics of the day, this blueprint of Black sexual politics linked homoeroticism to the memory and legacy of slavery, expanded the meaning and expressions of Black masculinity, and maintained a critical stance toward patriarchal institutions that perpetuated domineering models of Black masculinity. In the essay, Down at the Cross, from The Fire Next Time, Baldwin records a meeting between himself and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Black Muslims. Baldwin recalls being frightened upon receiving a summons from the leader to come to his house for dinner, saying, "I was frightened because I had, in effect, been summoned into a royal presence." Baldwin was so afraid, perhaps more afraid of the tension of this meeting inspires in himself, between love and power, between pain and rage. In the leader's home, Baldwin awaits the elder Black man while Muhammad's devotees attend to him before dinner. Baldwin experiences the meeting as tense and framed by much unspoken history shared between the two men. Ruminating to himself on the Muslims' belief that whites are devils, Baldwin thinks, for the horrors of the American Negro's life, there has been almost no language. The privacy of his experience, which is only beginning to be recognized in language and which is denied and ignored in official and popular speech. More specifically, Baldwin emphasizes with Muhammad's own tragic story, which involved seeing his father hang before his eyes. His father's blood rushed out, and as Baldwin has heard it, Muhammad saw this same blood rush down and splash down through the leaves of a tree on him. On a trip to Georgia years earlier, Baldwin had wondered how the red clay of the earth had acquired its color, had wondered at how the red clay of the earth had acquired its color from the blood that had dripped down from these trees, lynching trees. He thinks of Willie McGee and of Emmett Till and a host of unnamed Black men lynched for supposedly violating white Southern women. Slave narratives are rife with examples of sons made to witness the momentary and long-term demise of their fathers. Many slaves, like John Jacobs, located their genealogy in a man, a father without authority, a husband and no protector. Baldwin acknowledges the right and responsibility of both he and Muhammad to claim and interpret this legacy of Black male emasculation. Muhammad, on the other hand, privileges his relationship to the legacy of the fathers over that of Baldwin. He equates Baldwin's homosexuality with whiteness and with having strayed from the race. He seeks to convert the invert before him, and in the posture of a paternal figure, he expresses concern for Baldwin's salvation, for his safety in the white world, and his confusion about what it truly means to be responsible for one's ancestral inheritance. Baldwin leaves Muhammad's home with the strong feelings of longing, unrequited need, and objection. I felt very close to him and really wished to be able to love and honor him as a witness, an ally, and a father. I felt that I knew something of his pain and his fury, and yes, even his beauty. Baldwin had come from a religious family. His father, a minister in the Baptist church, was a man who inspired in him intense feelings of love, resentment, and competition. Through his father, and by virtue of his own ancestral connections to the South, Baldwin had just as much right as Muhammad to make of the legacy of paternal pain that united them. The contestation over the meaning of the unspeakable past dictated Baldwin's interactions with Muhammad, and a decade later, strongly influenced his relationship to the Black men of 10 Black Writers Respond. Elijah Muhammad and the Black men from Clark's edited collection maintain one narrative of paternal pain, familial role, gender, and sexuality, and Baldwin, by virtue of his erotic and tribal relationship to the Black fathers, maintains another. At stake here are in part central questions of racial origins. Where do Black people, and in particular, where does Black masculinity come from? What is the ideal image of this masculine identity, and what does this image of Black manhood have to do with the larger racial liberation project? Muhammad and others draw upon a century-old model of Black masculinity originating out of violent, emasculating Black-white relations. However, Baldwin shifts the discussion of this violence away from the Black-white dynamic to a deeper terrain, the interior world of longing and pain perpetuated by and shared among Black men. In his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin situates the origins of Black masculinity in a racial mythology dating back to the first contact between Europeans and coastal Africans. The Curse of Ham is a myth of racial origins that deals with incest, homoerotic desire, and slave legacy between Black son and father. The Curse of Ham is one of the oldest racial mythologies used by whites to justify their inhuman treatment of the African and Black American. The curse involves a son named Ham looking upon the naked body of his father, Noah. As a result of looking at or touching his father, it's not clear which, the descendants of Ham are to be slaves. Some people say that in that story, he didn't look upon his father. He looked upon and was actually having relations with his father's wife, which was also a sin, which is why instead of cursing Ham, he got he cursed Canaan, which were the children of Ham. During slavery, Black men interpreted the curse in a number of different ways as an explanation for their infantilized relationship to white slave owners, as an explanation for why they descended from the tribe of Cush rather from the tribe of Canaan, the cursed son, and as a way of talking about the introduction of white blood into an African lineage. Curiously, missing from most discussions is the curse is a reference to its overt homoerotic implications. The son looking upon the father's nakedness and responding with desire or even erotic touch. It doesn't say or imply that anywhere in the Bible. It says he looks upon his father's nakedness, which some people interpret as being his father's wife. It doesn't say he touched his father or himself. It doesn't say he got off. As a matter of fact, he went and told his brothers about it. So if he told his brothers about it, how does it make sense that he touched his father? But anyway, Baldwin explores the homoerotic implications of this racial mythology through the characters of John the son and Gabriel the father in Go Tell It on the Mountain. Baldwin reenacts the curse of Ham by having John, while scrubbing his father's back in the bathtub, look down upon his father's nakedness as Ham had originally done to Noah. Yes, he had sinned. One morning alone in the dirty bathroom in the square, dirt gray cupboard room that was filled with the stink of his father, sometimes leaning over the cracked, tattletale gray bathtub, he scrubbed his father's back and looked as the accursed son Noah had looked on his father's hideous nakedness. It was a secret, like sin, and slimy, like the serpent, and heavy, like the rod. Then he hated his father and longed for the power to cut his father down. Those sound like personal issues that James Baldwin was having. As with Turner and Willis from The Confessions of Nat Turner, religion frames the tense relationship between John and his father. Gabriel, who sits in the bathtub, is a deacon at their local Harlem Baptist church. Gabriel was called to the ministry as a youth and practices a type of Southern Christianity that dates back to slavery. It is in the context of desire for and hatred towards his father that John attempts to understand larger questions of racial origins and the grander cosmic meaning behind the enslavement and dislocation of Africans. Referring even more directly to the biblical curse in his blood, he laments, "This and not that other, his deadly sin, having looked on his father's nakedness and mocked and cursed him in his heart. Ah, that son of Noah's had been cursed, down to the present groaning generation. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." Baldwin's use of and representation of homosexuality in Go Tell It on the Mountain goes far beyond sex act and contemporary homosexual politics. What the scenario between John and his father speaks to is the intrinsic way that homoeroticism has, from the very beginning, figured centrally in the mythic originary landscape of African American experience. While Blacks have worked hard to construct a mythology of the race based in the male-female conjugal union and the Adam and Eve as mythic gender prototypes, Baldwin exposes a different racial genealogy rooted in the homoerotic interchange between father and son and between Black male compatriots and brothers. This other unspeakable homoerotic legacy was an even more painful and raw wound for Black men. How could Black men talk about need, desire, and eroticism among themselves without also talking about the numerous ways in the context of slavery in which intimate ties have been denied, violently circumvented, or routed through the body and person of a white master, overseer, or some other ruling class whites? In so many ways, this history was repeated in Styron, whom whites billed as an authentic and authoritative interpreter of the Black male experience and motivations. The other homosexual scene in Styron's novel that stirred up a great amount of controversy focused on Ethelred T. Brantley, an assistant plantation overseer. Harding describes Brantley as a social outcast among whites, a mentally retarded person, repulsive homosexual whose specialty seems to be the molesting of young boys. Brantley, this disgusting, despicable person, is attracted to Turner's preaching, which has the effect, according to Harding, of diminishing the personal charisma and visionary message of Turner in the novel. Styron does paint a despicable picture of Brantley. His face is pockmarked, and he alludes a flatulence that smells like air from a swamp bottom. Added to all of this is the fact that he is a confessed child molester. As I note in earlier chapters, it was not unusual for homoerotic appetites in the overseer to spill over into the punishment of enslaved persons. And while I agree with Harding that Styron does attempt to use Brantley to diminish the power of Turner, there is also the real and largely unexplored sexual history between overseers and male slaves. This history is present in the violent interchange between Douglass and Covey, but Black scholars such as Harding have preferred to emphasize this. What Black scholars such as Harding have preferred to emphasize is the violent exchange, the fight unto liberty or death, instead of examining the complicated ways slaves had to negotiate the homoerotics of plantation life. That was a mouthful. So what he's saying is that Black scholars have just totally ignored the homosexual aspects of this. And when we talk about buck breaking and we talk about this white male domination over the Black body, right? We recognize that buck breaking happened on all manner of plantation, and that some of these Black men became effeminate or cowered to the white male overseer because they were terrified of having this experience happen to them again. I don't think that this is something that they enjoyed. It was a part of the breaking process. And he seems to be totally blind to the fact that they used sexual violence and terror as a mechanism of control because they got off on it. By simplifying the debate into two types, the Black man who was virile and could not be consumed, and the Black male who was effeminate, tender-fleshed, and could be consumed, we have missed out on a deeper understanding of the ways homoeroticism has permeated Black liberation discourse. When I first cited Harding's comments on cannibalism at the beginning of this chapter, I told only part of the story, the part of the story that concerned white appetites for consumption. However, it was not as simple as I initially suggested, that only white people wanted to consume, ingest, and be filled with Black male essence. Black men wanted this too, however, for entirely different and sacred reasons. Harding upbraids and severely criticizes Styron for cannibalizing Turner. At the same breath, and in the same breath, Harding speaks of Turner's message, his virile word, and his masculinity as something that Black men, such as himself, can eat. Turner's body and words going down as sweet as honey. He likens Turner to Ezekiel from the Bible. Ezekiel, who was forced to eat the scroll of the Lord's word, to fill his stomach with the terrible oracles of God. In Harding's articulation, fierce religious conviction, power, and liberating truth tenderize Black male flesh into a nourishing source, ingested and integrated into the Black spiritual collective. In her essay, Where, by the Way, Is This Train Going? A Case for Reframing Black Cultural Studies, Mae G. Henderson comments upon the Oedipal flesh-eating dynamic between Black sons like Harding and other symbolic fathers such as W.E.B. Du Bois, John Henrik Clarke, and George Washington Williams. Harding, she writes, constructs the origins of Black studies in a narrative which fashions an Oedipal tale of Black sons, especially with westernized training, who seek to devour their fathers. Black studies served as an intellectual counterpart to Black power activism and community-based organizing. What Black feminists and so-called homophile figures such as Baldwin are painfully aware of was how this dynamic of the chosen Black son excluded Black women and homosexual men as representative voices of Black experience. As Henderson points out, Black men sanctioned, institutionalized even, the homoerotic triad among father, son, and Western white male tradition. In his Beyond Chaos, Black History and the Search for the New Land, the document to which Henderson's comments refer, Harding makes reference to the character of True Blood from Ralph Ellison's novel, The Invisible Man. He romanticizes True Blood's raping of his daughter, the Black female sexual orifice bonding, True Blood, and the white man, Mr. Norton, in an erotic tryst. Mr. Norton realized that True Blood had struggled with some of the same demons which he had sought to escape. It was then that Norton exclaimed in wonder, "You have looked upon the chaos and are not destroyed." The Black man and white man feel unified in their fear, objectification, and use of the Black female's body, her vagina. True Blood projects his own feelings of emasculation, sexual violation, and economic disempowerment into the Black female body. Wow. The more central problem here, though, is Black male interiority, the Black male orifice. The Black female body is, and always has, served as a convenient, all too familiar tabula rasa for working out confusions, aggressions, instabilities, and a host of other masculine anxieties. If we replace the female body with that of the male, the essay's reference to chaos takes on new meaning. Chaos as the Black male anus, chaos as the Black male mouth, chaos as the metaphysical and quantum conundrum of a Black male orifice that devours and consumes as easily as it might constitute and reify masculinity. In the section that follows this discussion, Harding talks of the same Blackness that he associates with True Blood and the Black fathers as something that he, in the darkness, touches, gropes, and gropes with erotic longing. As we handle our Blackness, we are tempted to fondle it, to worship it, to lie down in its beauty and sleep a long Black sleep of wrapping and joy. The sentence that follows this one clarifies the referent to the phallic might of Black revolutionaries, such as Brother Fanon and our fathers. Under the guise of revolution, of racial uplift and racial unity, Harding's observations reveal a powerfully charged domain of Black male experience, wherein the consumption of and groping of the phallus, sons eating fathers and fathers eating sons, and a general erotic sharing among Black men is the norm. It is a painful, mythic, and social reality that Harding imagines, in which hurt is necessary, for it grows at once out of the nature of the struggle and out of the natural tendency of sons, especially especially with westernized training to seek to devour their fathers. Harding writes against a legacy of consuming Blacks, tasting them, and making them delectable objects of white phallic authority, for that is the ultimate tragedy and failure of paternal figures such as, excuse me, George Washington Williams, Booker T. Washington, and even Carter G. Woodson, that they function as delectable Negroes who have so deeply internalized the palate of white fathers that they cannot help but feed their male progeny in body, soul, and essence to the insatiable hunger of white America. For example, Williams, the author of the first full-length historical treatment of Black people in the Americas, whose writing, History of the Negro Race in America, 1619 to 1880, published in 1885, advocated Black assimilation into the body politic when he says, colored people had always displayed a matchless patriotism and an incomparable heroism in the cause of Americans. Williams glorified the white male body of persons such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Abraham Lincoln. He also glorified the tenets of law of American democracy. Contrary to Harding's glorification of the Black male body, and in particular the phallus, Williams' primary romantic affection is toward the white male for whom the state is an extension of his authority and power to either annihilate or consume. As a devouring Black father who has an appetite spurred by his loyalty to the drives and palates of the white fathers, Williams is a figure that the Black sons must devour if the race is to survive. Give me one moment. We only have a couple of more pages left. Thank you so much for sticking with me tonight. And it's crazy how he's saying that if the Black race is to survive, we have to annihilate and consume these Black fathers, or we got to lay down what they put down. In addition to casting Black history and collectively in a traditional gender framework that threatens to undermine the invention he is attempting to make, what also occurs within Harding's tableau of eat or be eaten is that so much complexity and differing meanings of appetite and consumption get obscured. The general sexual violation of Black men during slavery does not figure into Harding's analogy. According to Harding, this history and the figure of the sexually violated Black man literally represents the threat of Black male virility being devoured by inverted sexuality. The ultimate psychic and social threat of the effeminate or raped Black is not only that he can take in sex, hunger for and desire it in his interior, but also that he has, in addition to this hunger, the capacity to castrate, bite, chew, and disappear into a teeming chaos, the continuity and vital essence of the race. Harding's glorification and eroticization of the Black male phallus demonstrates how homoeroticism was intrinsic to Black cultural formation in his formulations, whereas the invert, who resonates too closely with historical notions of Black men as unclean, as unchristian, as licentious, as effeminate, unbounded, and insane, is the figure that has been most difficult to incorporate into the body politic. In There is a River, the Black Struggle for Freedom in America, Harding refers to Malcolm X as the shining Black prince of the Northern movement. King was also often referred to in this way by Black men. Black people worshiped both men, saw them as beauty itself, and both radiated a seductive air of rest and long-awaited joyfulness. Harding romanticizes the seductive virility of Blackness and its hidden phallic implications. So too does he romanticize female rape, incest, and white male fascination with women raped on the plantation. This dynamic calls to mind the contradictory words and actions of Eldridge Cleaver. On the one hand, Cleaver could lambaste Baldwin as a virile Negro homosexual, a race traitor, and so forth, and on the other hand, show up at a party with Huey P. Newton, run into Baldwin at the party, and engage Baldwin in a long, passionate French kiss. Newton recalls, in 1967, Cleaver was invited to a special dinner for James Baldwin, who had just returned from Turkey, and he in turn invited me. When we arrived, Cleaver and Baldwin walked into each other, and the giant 6'3" Cleaver bent down and engaged in a long, passionate French kiss with a tiny, barely 5 feet tall Baldwin. Wow. Wow, that's crazy. Huey P. Newton saw Eldridge Cleaver passionately kiss homosexual James Baldwin. Another example from the civil rights era is King, who engaged in frequent sexual escapades with white and Black women in scenarios that involved him and other men having sex in the same room and switching female partners and doing who knows what else. Now, this has not been proven based on the limited knowledge that I have of this scenario, but this is that white mythology that goes, because he doesn't cite a source here, he doesn't have any notes here, he's just making this statement. He's saying that Martin Luther King was engaging in sex with white women, Black women, he was unfaithful to Coretta, and that they were doing God knows what else in those rooms. I don't have a source for that, so I don't take that as true. This is propaganda. King clearly loved sex and exhibited an uninhibited aspect of his sexual nature. Yet King folded under pressures from within the movement to publicly distance himself from Bayard Rustin, the openly homosexual strategist and organizer of the March on Washington, and to not allow Rustin to speak at the March on Washington. All of which brings me to the question, what are we really talking about when we talk about homoeroticism in the civil rights and Black power eras? and in particular in the context of slavery. How are we to make sense of Harding's idea of the sacred consumption of the Black fathers alongside the glorification of Black female rape and the demonization and misrecognition of homoeroticism during Harding's time and in the context of slavery? What Harding understood as sacred consumption was partially that, but it was also part of something larger, more complicated, and disturbing. Douglass, for example, was painfully aware of those aspects of the slave experience that were causing us to eat our own flesh. In his slave narrative, Douglass referred to the legacy of violence and terror that had caused many slaves to remain frozen in terror and apathetic to their bonded status. He referred to the constant haunting presence of grim death, a catch-all term for the range of horrid deaths that resulted from dispersion, nihilism, and soul murder. Douglass understood self-consumption as a process of turning in upon the self, a natural response to the physical and spiritual starvation endemic to the culture of slavery. Fixated on the idea of the valiant, heroic Black man who is impervious to consumption, except consumption in a sacred way, we have remained transfixed by those final determining words. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man. Especially in the 1960s, most Black people accepted the battle as the index of Black masculinity largely without question. Yet, what I have been attempting to elucidate throughout this chapter are more subtle levels of warfare and resistance that defy simplistic dyads, consumed and not consumed, effeminate and masculine, race man and not race man. As mightily as Black people have struggled to fend off the reality of Nat Turner's consumption, the fact is that he was most likely literally consumed. And in the meantime, our analytical, psychic, and political tools have been insufficient to the task of analyzing how his consumption was possible, how it might in fact be ongoing, and how we, in the present moment, are implicated in the legacy of Turner's consumption. And that is the end of chapter 5. So as you can see, the book is saying that Martin Luther King might have had some bisexual tendencies. The book is saying that Martin Luther King was very promiscuous and might have had some male on male action. And what we have to remember is that the book was written by a queer white liberal, right? It was edited by a queer white liberal. We have to remember that it was written and organized and compiled by, these are the notes of a queer Black man. And they have an agenda and a desire to see queerness everywhere. They're looking for potential opportunities to insert in this book and in this text opportunities for queerness to be mainstreamed. What we need to know about this chapter is that Nat Turner was literally consumed, and that we need to read the book written in the 19th century if we want to know what actually happened to him during his time in prison before he was lynched. We need to recognize that this consumption of him after his death in a second retelling in the lynching of Nat Turner is something that the white media was trying to do to change the narrative of who Nat Turner was. It was an opportunity for them to try to rewrite the history in a fictionalized way. And they gave this book so much critical acclaim and gave it so much notoriety that Dr. John Henrik Clarke and 10 other Black writers had to respond to it. Sister Ross says, "Me sure he was with with Caucasoid females for show." There it is. So he was with white females for show. We don't know about all of these other people that he was supposed to be with. I would like to thank Arbiter 567, Sister Raw, Redo 9002, and the Forecast Radio for being here with me tonight. I know that Bawana Hagaziki is listening. Casidra Cheek from Where I'm in the Bush is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. KW Don 7 is listening. Brother Bakari is listening. And so many others. I appreciate you for staying here with me. And I hope you all have a lovely evening. I'll be back on Tuesday with the final part of this book, and we can put this book to bed. We can say that we've read it, and we will have a survey up over the weekend to see which direction we're going into next. I also ask that you listen to some of my other content on my other channel. It's called God News Only, but I'm still working through the titling of it. But I put a link up, and I put an 8-minute video up about how to renew your mind and how to start the process of thinking through who you are and how you see yourself. So if you have an opportunity to take a listen. Good night, Sister Ra, and the elders that are listening with you. Thank you so much for being here. Peace, guys.